Hello, everybody. If you don't remember my voice, this is Mike Jaworski, your instructor for Environmental Impact Assessment. Just a couple of quick administrative notes before we begin. First, as you know, this is an asynchronous lecture, so you can watch and engage with it on your own schedule before our next class. We won't be meeting in person this Tuesday, September 9th, due to a conference obligation that I have. But we will be meeting back in person on Thursday, September 11th, and I look forward to seeing all of you then. By now, you should have completed the required readings for this introductory module. So Chapter 1, Aims and Objectives of Environmental Assessment, and Chapter 13, which is Professional Practice and Ethics. And both of those chapters can be found in your Noble textbook that I hope you've all acquired by now. If you haven't, please do come see me or send me an email. Now, these two chapters may seem quite different, but I've assigned them together intentionally here. So chapter 1 is going to give us the essential what and why of EIA, its history, its purpose, and the general process. Well, chapter 13, on the other hand, that is going to start introducing us to the who, the practitioners on the ground, and the critical ethical principles that really have to guide their work. So yeah, today we'll be laying the groundwork for understanding EIA. We'll start with, why we need it, what kinds of environmental and social problems does it, try to address, and why it has become such a key part of development decision-making, particularly in Canada, right? So we'll talk about how EIA is defined and actually why that's maybe more complicated than it sounds, and look at where it came from while exploring the different values and interests that shape how people approach it. Then we'll walk through the EIA process itself step by step and talk about the major players involved, from project proponents to regulators and Indigenous communities and the general public. And then finally, we'll shift to the ethical side of EIA. What does it mean to be a responsible practitioner? What role should values and judgment play in a system that's often treated as technical and neutral? And we all know that it's anything but those things, right? We'll close with a real-world scenario to get you all thinking, about the ethical tensions that often come up in practice. We aren't together in class for that discussion scenario, though, so I'll be getting you to, think about things on your own, and we can regroup on Thursday together on that. So, what is environmental impact assessment? How do we define it? What is the need? This question is, especially relevant in Canada. The natural resource sector is a huge part of our economy. More than 1.8 million jobs, 17% of our GDP, and over $585 billion in planned or ongoing projects were scheduled as of 2018. And these projects bring economic opportunity, but they also bring risk with them, right? Especially to our land, our water, wildlife, and our local communities. Really, the need for environmental impact assessment is all about that need to ask, well, what's the trade-off? How are we making this decision? Because the reality is that the scale of industrial activity in this country is absolutely massive. More than 2.6 million square kilometers of Canada are under some form of industrial concession, from mining claims to oil and gas leases to forestry operations, and that's over a quarter of the country's landmass. And, this is having an impact on our country. 4 of our ecozones are already more than 50% accessed, meaning that they're fragmented by roads and pipelines and other types of infrastructure. And our natural spaces are shrinking. They're becoming disconnected. Between 2000 and 2013, we lost nearly 5% of Canada's intact forest landscapes, many of which were among some of the largest remaining on the planet. And so we have to understand the ecological cost of this sort of development. It's very real and it's often long term. It can have cumulative effects as well, as we'll learn later on in the course. And this is where EIA comes in. EIA is a tool that is going to help us pause and assess what might happen if we move forward and how we might avoid, reduce, or offset those impacts. EIA doesn't stop development, but it is going to help us make better and more informed decisions about it. So let's talk about what we mean when we say environmental impact assessment, right? The thing is that defining EIA isn't very straightforward. It depends a lot on context, on who's doing the assessment, where, under what laws and for what purpose. But if there's kind of one idea that always holds true, it's this idea of the precautionary principle. The idea of look before you leap. Because at its heart, EIA is all about taking a pause and thinking critically before we lock in decisions that might have serious consequences. You might also hear people refer to it as impact assessment, and I'll often do this in class, just calling it IA, right? Rather than environmental impact assessment. And this shift in language actually reflects a broader understanding of how EIA has evolved over time, because we know as practitioners of EIA that impacts aren't just ecological. We're also talking about human health, indigenous rights, socioeconomic well-being, cultural values. All of these things are interconnected, right? Into broader socio-ecological systems. Now, the International Association on Impact Assessment, right, the IAIA, offers a pretty widely cited definition, which we'll be using for a good portion of this course, I would say. And they define EIA as the process of identifying, predicting, evaluating, and mitigating the biophysical, social, and other relevant effects of development proposals prior to major decisions being taken and commitment made. So I like this definition by the IAIA because it's not just about, identifying problems, it's also about predicting them. It's about figuring out how significant they are, and it's about proposing ways to avoid or manage those risks, all of which are an important part of the EIA process. So, let's take a moment and kind of break that down a little bit more, because not all EIA processes are the same, right? Noble is very clear that we need to distinguish between formal and informal environmental assessment. So, when we're talking about formal EA, this is the one that most of us are going to be familiar with. So it's written into law, it follows specific regulations, and results in a regulatory, decision being made, usually an approval or a denial with some form of conditions. And really that is the type of assessment that we will be focused on in this course. But there's also informal environmental assessment, and it looks similar, but it isn't required by law. So a company or group might do it to be proactive. They might do it to build social license or legitimacy within the communities that they're working. But really, at the end of the day, there's no legal decision being made. So it may or may not follow best practices. Finally, I would say that when defining environmental impact assessment, it's worth emphasizing that EIA is both a technical tool and a governmental process, right? A regulatory process. It produces science, but it's also about values and power and decision making. And that is part of what makes it so interesting, but also challenging as we're going to see. So on that note, let's kind of dig into one of the core tensions that defines environmental impact assessment, not just in theory, but in every kind of like real world application that I can think of anyways. You know, whose perspective is being centered and what is the process really trying to achieve in EIA? At first glance, EIA might look like a neutral and technical process, right? A way to collect data, to make rational, science-based decisions. And don't get me wrong, science and evidence absolutely matter in EIA. But it's also about politics and values and power and ethics. And different people come to the EIA process with very different assumptions about what it should be doing. And that can create a lot of friction, right? Because when we're looking at environmental impact assessment, values and philosophies really matter. EIA isn't just a method, it's a space where different philosophies can clash. You know, on one end of the spectrum, we might have what we would call, analytical rationalism, or the belief that, better data and more accurate predictions will lead to better decision making. And, this is often the domain of engineers and ecologists and regulators focused on measurable impacts and thresholds. But on the other end, EIA is also kind of the civic process, and it's one that should, at least in my opinion, empower marginalized voices, center community concerns, and really ensure that justice and participation are being built into the decision-making process around these big development projects. Now, this perspective views EIA as kind of a democratic safeguard, especially for those who often don't have much of a say in how large-scale projects move forward. The important point here is that both sides of that coin are valid. Both are present in every environmental impact assessment process, at least in Canada. And really for us, the challenge is figuring out how to navigate between them. Now, I mostly bring this up because, there's this importance surrounding expectations that isn't just philosophical. It shows up in everyday practice. If a local community is already opposed to a project, they might see the entire EIA process as, well, kind of performative, right? A way to justify a decision that's already been made. And that is especially true if their values aren't reflected in the framing or the initial planning of the assessment. So, this drives us to ask really important questions when thinking about EIA, right? Like, what counts as a significant impact? What knowledge is considered credible? And, who is going to get a seat at the table? All of this is going to drive our ability to meet and engage with these different expectations, both from regulatory, folks, to community members, to those seeking impact assessment on behalf of a project. So as future practitioners and decision makers, or, maybe community advocates, one of the most important things that we can all do is understand and manage these expectations, right? This means recognizing that scientific credibility and social legitimacy don't always align, and that sometimes even a well-executed EIA will be seen as a failure if it doesn't reflect people's, deeper concerns or their lived experience. And in practice, and as you saw in your readings, this really matters because, some people treat EIA as kind of this checkbox exercise, while others see it as basically the only opportunity to influence major development. if you're a practitioner in that space, how you're going to show up to that discussion matters. Your choices, what you choose to include in your scoping process, and how you communicate uncertainty or respond to public input is going to tip the balance towards either trust or conflict a lot of the time. So, yeah, as we move through the rest of the course, I just want you to keep on asking, whose values are being reflected here? What assumptions are driving the process? And is EIA functioning as a scientific tool, a civic tool, or something in between? And it's that critical lens that's going to turn you from a technician into a reflective practitioner, which is really what I hope you will become. To really understand environmental impact assessment and how it works and why it matters, we really have to look at where it came from before we do anything, right? So the first thing to understand is, especially in the US, where it first began to appear during the 1960s, the EIA kind of like story starts with this broader cultural and political shift. This was a time when people began to seriously question the environmental costs of industrial growth. And I mean, there she is on the screen, right? One of the most influential catalysts was definitely Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962. She would later die, I believe, in 1964. Her work really highlighted kind of the ecological and human health dangers of pesticide use, especially DDT, and challenged the idea that, technological progress was inherently good. She really did help spark what we would now call the modern environmental movement that occurred during the 1960s. During this period, pollution, biodiversity loss, and just the visible degradation of natural spaces were starting to push their way into the public eye for the first time. And there was this growing recognition that industrial expansion came with real risks, not just for ecosystems, but also for public health and long-term sustainability. And really, before this, and, in the post-World War II era, most of this was seen as the domain of scientists, of experts, right? In the 1960s, we started to see kind of this democratization where everyday people were fighting for a space at the table to be part of the decision-making process. The question during this period really became, how do we hold developers and governments accountable before damage is done? Before damage is done to our environment, before damage is done to our communities. The U.S. National Environmental Policy Act, passed in 1969 and then implemented in 1970, was really groundbreaking. It was the first national law in the U.S. to require environmental considerations to be formally built into project planning. And it came out of people questioning this expert-driven kind of environmental assessment regime that had, been occurring previously, where people weren't really involved in the process, where people didn't get to ask questions. And really, it did this by introducing new concepts. And one of these concepts was the Environmental Impact Statement, or the EIS. And the EIS became really a core feature of environmental impact assessment systems. Basically, it required proponents to describe a number of things, such as, what they're proposing, what environment or communities might be affected, what the likely impacts were, and how those impacts would be managed or monitored. And this National Environmental Policy Act established kind of this principle that you don't get approval until you've shown that you understand and can manage the risks. I mean, that might seem really obvious now, but in the 1960s, this was actually kind of a revolutionary idea. Now, once once that policy was in place, other countries started to follow suit. So Canada was actually the first to adopt environmental impact assessment after the US, introducing it as a set of federal guidelines in 1973. And although that was good, it still wasn't embedded into our actual laws until 1995, though it was obviously in use well before that. Australia followed Canada in 1975. The European Union passed its Environmental Assessment Directive in 1985, giving EIA a legal foundation across all of its different member states. And since then, it's really gone global. Today, over 190 UN member nations have national EIA legislation or are party to international agreements that require some form of impact assessment before, major projects can go through. Developing countries also often have high quality laws on paper, but it is important to understand that, implementation can be a major challenge there. So enforcement, funding, and government capacity can often be weak in developing countries. And in some cases, the legal frameworks are more in place because of foreign investment or aid requirements than, them actually forming a meaningful regulatory regime within the country. So, I mean, what is the take-home message here? EIA is now one of the most widely adopted environmental management tools in the world. But as we'll see, as I continue to go through these slides, the gap between legislation and practice is a big issue. And good laws don't always lead to good outcomes. So, let's take a pause. Let's take a pause to have a bit of a reality check about what the limits of environmental impact assessment are, especially as it's currently practiced in Canada. We often talk about EIA as if it's, a gatekeeper, something that stands between us and, harmful development. But in reality, it's not actually a mechanism designed to stop development. Even projects that are found to have significant adverse environmental effects often still get the green light. We just have to look at these numbers, right? 95% of projects that completed a federal EIA in Canada were ultimately approved. And even among those where significant adverse effects were formally identified, of those 73% still received approval. I think that's worth, just sitting with for a moment and asking, what does this tell us? Well, what this tells us is that EIA isn't a tool of prohibition. It is a tool of justification and risk management. It is about documenting impacts. It is about proposing mitigation measures and then helping decision makers weigh trade-offs. Because in many cases, those trade-offs are going to include economic benefits, energy security, political priorities, or other strategic considerations. So when we say that a project was approved despite significant effects, what we're actually saying here is, yes, this project will likely harm species at risk habitat, or increase greenhouse gas emissions, or affect indigenous land use. But we've decided that those impacts are justified in the broader public interest. Now, it's really up to you to decide, is that a failure of EIA or its design? And, when we start asking those kinds of questions, that's where it really gets interesting. Some critics are going to argue that if EIA rarely results in a project being rejected, then basically it's just a rubber stamp. At the same time, others are going to say, no, this is exactly what EIA is supposed to do. It is supposed to inform decisions, not make them. And, at the end of the day, both of those, you know, sides are kind of right, depending on your expectations of the process. It really shows that, this gap between public perception and the actual function of EIA is a really important thing to understand. Communities will often engage in good faith, believing that if their concerns are serious enough, that the project might not proceed. And when that rarely happens, it's going to fuel distrust, not just in EIA, but in the broader systems of environmental governance in our country, right? And, with all of that happening, we're a system under strain. It's worth noting that, it, like, is our EIA system trying to do too much here? It's being asked to handle project level analyses and respond to cumulative effects. It's being asked to engage communities and deliver decisions on tight timelines. What else? It's being asked to assess technical risks while navigating political realities. And sometimes EIA ends up absorbing larger social and environmental issues that should really be addressed through, regional planning or indigenous governance or national policy, some other system. But a lot of the time, those systems are weak or absent, and the EIA process becomes kind of this pressure valve, one that isn't always designed to handle kind of the weight it's carrying. It's something to take note of. Okay. So up until now, we've basically been talking about EIA as this, existential thing, kind of a mechanism that we use. But I don't want you to get the idea that EIA is some sort of, single event within this broader process of environmental governance. Because in reality, EIA is a really complex, multi-phase process that involves a wide range of actors and obligations and forms of knowledge. And I'd really just like to briefly walk through kind of each stage, keeping in mind the larger theme of, consultation and participation and engagement that really has to run across the whole process, as you'll see from this figure at the bottom of the screen, right? And please don't worry if you feel like this rather kind of brief review is lacking, because we are going to be going through each of these different phases in much greater depth in the coming weeks, right? So first up in the EIA process is pre-project planning, right? And this is the stage before anything is formally submitted, and it's often invisible to the public, actually. The project proponent will begin by consulting with potentially affected communities, especially indigenous groups, to identify early concerns and basically co-develop a community engagement plan. And this is also where proponents, might start to negotiate private benefit sharing agreements, or things like financial contributions, job guarantees, or access to services for the host community. And at the same time, governments might start to initiate land use consultations, particularly around, land tenure or indigenous title and reserve lands. And in some cases, this is also where the Crown's duty to consult is going to get triggered under Canadian law. So this step is really, really important because it's basically going to set the tone for the rest of the EIA process. And it's often at this moment where trust is, built or broken, depending on the level of engagement in the pre-project planning process. Now, as we move on to the next phase of project description, this is the first formal document that's going to be submitted by the proponent. It's going to outline the project's scope, its location, technologies, expected timelines, and really broad objectives. But it is more than just a formality here. This document is going to frame the entire rest of the assessment. how impacts are described, how mitigation is discussed, and how communities are represented in this document are going to have major implications for what gets assessed later on. And sometimes it's at this stage where kind of controversial elements can be revealed for the project for the very first time. And if done poorly, it can lead to early opposition or legal challenges as well. Now, after that, we move to screening. Now, screening is kind of a gatekeeping stage. It's going to determine whether a full environmental assessment is even required. Screening is going to look at factors like project size, its location. For example, if it's near a protected area or on unceded indigenous land. It's also going to look at potential environmental or social impacts as well. And some projects that are put through are just going to be automatically subject to assessment, like, mines above a certain size, while others are going to be subject to more discretionary screening processes. So in Canada, screening can lead to, a few different pathways. So there's a federal impact assessment, right? There's a provincial process, a joint review, or basically no assessment at all. So this screening is actually a pretty high stakes stage, especially for the proponent and for Indigenous communities as well. Especially for Indigenous communities, they might not be consulted until much later in the process if the project is screened out. And no assessment is required. So next up, we have scoping and baseline assessment. So scoping is going to determine kind of the boundaries of the assessment. What impacts are in, what are out, and how deeply are these impacts going to be studied. Basically, we're asking, who's going to decide what matters here. And really, that's a political and ethical question if you think about it, right? So stakeholder input is often sought out through public comment periods during this time, but decision makers still ultimately kind of define the terms of reference for the scoping and baseline assessment. For example, like scoping might include water quality, but it might exclude, say, gendered impacts on nearby communities, unless that's raised as a major concern, right? So baseline studies begin here too. Those are going to establish, kind of a pre-project snapshot of ecological, social health, economic conditions, that sort of thing. And if that baseline kind of snapshot is shallow or flawed, it's going to create an issue because then all future comparisons become unreliable. So it is very, very important to have accurate and well-sourced baseline assessment, snapshots before you move on. Next up is what we would call impact assessment, right? This is the core analytical stage. Experts and sometimes communities study how the project might alter that baseline assessment. They're going to assess direct, indirect, cumulative, short-term and long-term impacts across the physical environment, the economy, social structures, health, culture, etc. And this stage is going to draw on a range of different tools. So environmental modeling, such as like water flow emissions. It's going to draw on risk assessment procedures, traditional knowledge and community input, social and health impact assessments. Those are all going to, have a part here. And uncertainty is a really big issue during this stage. Predictions are made with, no matter how hard we work at it, they're going to be made with imperfect data. And really, cumulative effects they're pretty hard to quantify. So it's during the stage that, judgment and values are really gonna enter the fray, even when the work might seem particularly technical. Now, after that impact assessment stage, we move on to strategies for managing impacts. So, once the impacts are known, the proponent is going to have to propose mitigation measures or design changes, pollution controls, community benefit agreements, habitat offsets, or possibly even redesign their entire project, right? So during this stage, kind of the key question is, what happens when impacts can't be fully mitigated? And that is going to lead to kind of this idea of residual impacts, which is very important for us in this class, right? So mitigation should mitigation impacts and strategies should follow this hierarchy of avoidance where we try to, avoid impacts, then we try to minimize impacts, then we try to restore the issues caused by those impacts, and lastly, we try to offset negative environmental impacts. So oftentimes, offsets get used far too quickly here without exhausting those other options, and it's something that we need to consider. So stage 7, right? Significance determination. Now, this is going to be one of the most value-laden and contested stages. Based on all of the data gathered, regulators are going to have to decide, whether remaining impacts are significant. And really that term significant varies by jurisdiction. But for our uses here, it often considers things like magnitude, duration, frequency, whether or not impacts are reversible, and the public's concern, right? So what is determined significant during the stage? I mean, unfortunately, it's going to be quite subjective in many cases. And I mean, for example, like wetland loss might be insignificant on paper, but devastating to a local indigenous community, right? So we have to think about this stage, like significance is also influencing whether or not the project is going to proceed and under what conditions. So we as practitioners, but also we as general members of the public, we need to think about what that term, quote unquote, significant, is actually taking into account whenever we see any of these major projects get approved or not approved. So after that significance determination, there is going to be a submission and review of the environmental impact statement. And that environmental impact statement, as I mentioned earlier when I was going through kind of the brief history of EIA, is the full report that is going to be submitted by the proponent. It is going to synthesize all of the data, all of the assessments, mitigation plans, consultation records. It is often thousands of pages long. I mean, which, just as an aside, kind of raises accessibility and transparency issues if you think about it. Like, can community members or local governments actually review a document of that size thoroughly, right? Public comment periods often happen here as well, as do, technical reviews by regulators, indigenous governments, third-party experts, that sort of thing. And this stage is also going to include kind of like potential revisions and supplemental studies as well, especially if key issues were kind of missing or flawed at earlier stages in the EIA process. Now, once that is done, once that environmental impact statement is submitted, we get to recommendations and a decision. So at this stage, finally, the regulatory body, like the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, is going to provide a final report with recommendations. But the actual decision is going to be made by some political authority, often, a minister or a cabinet, based on, whether or not the project is in the public interest. And if you think about it, this kind of opens the door for political considerations to override technical ones here. For example, a project might be recommended against, but still approved due to perceived economic benefits or political pressure. And this is where many communities feel the most disempowered, especially if consultation was inadequate and they don't feel like that political leader is taking their thoughts and lived experiences into account. Once a decision is made, we look at implementation and follow up. So if approved, the project is going to enter kind of this monitoring and compliance phase, which should almost always include monitoring plans to check predicted impacts, enforcement of approval conditions, adaptive management responses, and ongoing consultation with communities. Don't worry if you don't understand what all of those terms mean. We will be going through this in much more fine-toothed form later on in the term. Okay. This phase, though, is often underfunded, it's under-resourced, or ignored in some cases. Oftentimes, projects may proceed without sufficient oversight, and new data might not be incorporated into ongoing decision-making. That is a reality. Now, for Indigenous communities, this is where promises of inclusion also often fail to materialize, unless there's robust, co-governance frameworks that were negotiated earlier. So that's the process, right? I hope it wasn't too dry and technical. Let's move on to kind of roles and responsibilities. Trying to, take a moment and think about who's actually involved in EIA. I was talking about a lot of different folks there, right? Proponents, regulators, decision makers, affected interests, practitioners. Let's look at what each of these actually do. Because, environmental impact assessment is not just a technical checklist, it's a deeply collaborative, political, and often contested process. I mentioned it earlier, it's multi-actor, right? Meaning that a lot of different players are going to be involved. So project proponents, these are the folks who, they want to build something. Usually companies or government agencies proposing a project like, a dam or a highway or a port expansion or a wind farm. The project proponents are responsible for drafting the proposal, for funding technical studies, and showing how their project will comply with environmental regulations. And because they're the only ones who, might benefit from, like, financially or politically from the project in some cases, there's often pressure to kind of minimize predicted impacts or, frame the benefits in the best possible light. That's why scrutiny of their submissions is usually very important. Like, has it been greenwashed, for example, right? Because really the job of the project proponent is to make the case that the project is worth doing. Okay. Next up, we have regulators. These are the government agencies, right? These administer the EIA process. You can think of them as kind of the referees, but more accurately, maybe we could call them gatekeepers. They're the ones who say, like, hey, here's, what needs to be assessed. Here's the public. Here's how the public should be consulted. Or, here's a list of things that we need you to prove before this can be approved. They're also the ones that are going to be reviewing the submissions and ensuring that all legal, kind of procedural and, consultation obligations are met. And ideally, they're neutral. But in practice, they can sometimes face internal pressures, right? Especially when there's a political push for streamlining assessments or reducing red tape or something of that nature. So just making a point here, their independence really matters. And it's something that we as a public as well should really seek to protect. Next up, we have decision makers. So these are often elected ministers or senior bureaucrats. They're not usually scientists or engineers. Their job is to take all of the data, all of the input from communities, and all of the political priorities of the moment and decide, does this project serve the public interest? Now, of course, that phrase, public interest is super flexible. What counts as in the public interest? I mean, that could be jobs, it could be clean energy, it could be indigenous rights, it could be protecting a salmon stream or economic growth. And really, that's where, EIA becomes political, right? Even a strong evidence-based assessment can be overturned by a minister or approved despite deep concerns because of party policy priorities, right? We also have affected interests, and really, this is a very broad category of a role or responsibility, right? Although it is very important. Affected interests are going to include indigenous governments. They're going to include local residents. They're going to include non-governmental organizations or NGOs and environmental groups and even the general public. And it's these groups that are going to bring forward concerns, whether it's about salmon habitat, cultural sites, hunting practices, or just how a project will affect their daily life. Now, their involvement is critical for a fair and legitimate process. But at the same time, if you think about it, that's only going to work if they actually have the time or the resources and access to be meaningfully involved, which, as we'll discuss later in this course, is really not always the case. And finally, we have, practitioners. They're the technical experts, often consultants or specialists in biology, hydrology, social impacts, etc. These are the people who, do the work. They collect baseline data. They model the likely impacts. They propose mitigation strategies and prepare detailed reports. But here's the catch. Most of these practitioners are also often hired by the proponents. Now, that doesn't mean that they're biased, and many are highly ethical professionals, but it does raise questions about independence and credibility. And I mean, we rely on these practitioners to be rigorous and transparent and fair, especially when there's controversy. Really, their integrity helps hold the whole EIA system together. So practitioners are very important, and it's very important that they act in an ethical manner, as we will tackle for the last bit of this introduction to EIA. Okay, so yeah, let's step back a little, from the procedural nuts and bolts and really look at that ethical backbone of environmental impact assessment then. So again, I can't say this enough, environmental assessments, they're not just technical exercises in gathering data or checking boxes. They are moral, they are political. And because they involve trade-offs, judgments, and real-world consequences for communities and ecosystems, ethics needs to be front and center. For those who have not taken, say, an introductory, maybe philosophy class or something like that, ethics, it's really a branch of philosophy that just deals with how we decide what's right and wrong. Not just legally, because what is ethical is not always legal, and what is legal is not always ethical, but morally, right? And in the context of EIA, ethics shows up in questions like, are we protecting the most vulnerable ecosystems and communities? Are we being honest about the impacts or hiding behind vague language and models? And who decides what is a significant impact and based on whose values, right? At the core of this, there's what we might call, a social contract, a kind of unspoken agreement between the public and those conducting assessments. Society expects that EIA professionals and regulators and decision makers will act with integrity. And that means, they'll be honest, they'll be transparent, they won't fudge data or ignore concerns just to push a project through. And as I mentioned earlier, this trust is really essential because when it breaks down, when people think that the process is rigged or that their voices don't matter, the whole system loses legitimacy. And we also lose people from trying to involve themselves in the process as well. It's really, really important that EIA is not seen as being value free. And really, this is a big myth that is often perpetuated, that environmental assessments are somehow, neutral or objective. They're not, and we have to be honest about that. And there's a number of reasons why, right? First, being free from bias isn't the same as being value free. You can be a professional, you can follow best practices and still make judgment calls because EIA requires you to. There are no perfect formulas, okay? 2, values shape every stage of the process, from deciding what to study, the scoping process, to what counts as significant, to how we weigh economic versus ecological trade-offs. All of that involves choices based on values. What do we value more? 3, right? The idea of a significant adverse effect isn't just scientific. It is a threshold that society has to define through legislation and court cases and political decision making. We need to think about noise impacts near a school versus or a highway, or think about how the decibels might be the same, but the significance is going to be very different depending on the context or who's affected by that noise, like stuff like that, right? Next, Indigenous knowledge and cultural values don't fit neatly into spreadsheets. I cannot say this enough, but they are essentially, or they're absolutely essential, I should say, for understanding the full impact of a project and for making the process just. And ignoring them means missing out on fundamental worldviews and relationships to land and water that will not be captured unless they are given a seat at the table. And finally, we just have to accept the fact that political priorities are going to creep in. Job creation, energy independence, economic growth, these are all political values that shape how EIA reports are interpreted and whether a project is going to get greenlit. And sometimes this is going to happen explicitly, like when a minister overrules recommendations, but sometimes it's going to be more subtle, and we have to be on the lookout for it. Okay, so let's also take a minute here to kind of talk about that role of the expert in environmental impact assessment, because it's really not as straightforward as it might seem. Actually, I'm not sure if I've really made it that straightforward. When you're an assessor, you're not just crunching numbers or filling out checklists. You're playing a role, and how you choose to play that role really matters a lot. The book, The Honest Broker by Pilk, that Noble mentions in the chapter, it goes over these kind of like 4 ideal types of expert roles. And in the end, what we're really trying to get to is that idea of an honest broker. But it's worth going over kind of these idyllic kind of like examples of roles just to help understand better why an honest broker is truly needed. So Noble mentions, first of all, the pure scientist, right? This is a person who's all about the facts. They gather data, they run models, they publish results, and that's basically where it stops for them. They don't interpret the results in terms of policy or social impact. They stay in the lab, metaphorically speaking, and this role is basically important for rigor and objectivity, but it can also fall short in applied settings like EIA, where stakeholders need more than just raw data, right? So that's where we have something like the science arbiter, right? Think of this as kind of an expert who answers questions, but only when asked. So if the regulator says, hey, what's the predicted noise level from this construction site? The science arbiter will tell you. But they won't go out of their way to say, oh, and here's how that might affect nearby schools or wildlife, right? Again, science arbiter, useful, but maybe a bit reactive for the kinds of complex decisions that EI is meant to inform, right? And then we have, the issue advocate. This one's kind of interesting and maybe a bit controversial, right? The issue advocate has a position. They use data, but they're trying to steer the decision towards a specific outcome. Maybe they're pushing for a project to go forward because of economic benefits, or maybe they're advocating against it due to environmental risks. Either way, they're definitely not neutral. Now, sometimes advocacy is necessary, particularly for marginalized voices. But in EIA, assessors are expected to avoid this role to maintain overall trust in the process. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be issue advocates involved. It just means that our assessor should not be an issue advocate. And then, of course, there's the gold standard, kind of the honest broker. This is the role that assessors are supposed to play in EIA, right? So rather than narrowing the discussion, they expand the range of options and help others to fully understand kind of the scope and trade-offs of a project. It's not about being neutral in kind of like a passive sense. It's more about being informative, inclusive, and fair, right? So the honest broker is not going to shy away from complexity. They're going to clarify. They're not going to simplify. And they're going to help both decision makers and the public grasp what is really at stake, right? Why is that so important? Because environmental assessment is full of pressures, right? Political and financial and social pressures. And it's really easy to slip into advocacy or to play it safe by withholding information. But if we want EIAs to be trusted and transparent and legitimate, we need experts who can guide without pushing, who can help people understand the stakes without telling them what to think. That's the role of the honest broker, right? It's really, really hard, but it's essential. Now, for those of us in this course, folks who are new to this whole process, I could kind of like give you a very long, technical, and legal list of prescriptive responsibilities that are supposed to help us become these honest brokers. But really, I think for our purposes, the International Association of Impact Assessments kind of like code of ethics is probably a better place for us to start. It's a little bit more digestible as well. So I just wanted to go through kind of like each of these guidelines that should be that we should be following, right, as honest brokers if we're a practitioner. The first is, aligning with sustainability and environmental protection, right? So this first point sets the bar pretty high. We're not just checking boxes or minimizing harm. We're talking about aligning with principles of sustainable development and the highest standards of environmental protection. That means thinking long-term, being proactive, and really going beyond what is merely required by law. As practitioners, we should be doing that. Next, we need to put the public and environment first. And this one is key. IA members must put the environment and public welfare above sector or private interests. In practice, this means that if you're hired by a proponent, like a mining or an energy company, your professional responsibility is still to the public good, not the people paying your invoice. Now, that can be uncomfortable, but what this guideline is supposed to remind us of is that EIA isn't just a technical exercise. It's not just a job. It is a deeply held public trust that we are responsible for, okay? 3, you need to start early, not after the damage is already done. This is about timing. Ethical practitioners don't just jump in once the project is already finalized. They advocate for incorporating environmental and social considerations from the very start when things can still be changed. That means that influencing design and policy is important. It's not just about cleaning up after a fact. After all of the salmon have left a stream, right? This ties directly into the concept of being proactive rather than reactive in our assessment procedures. This is very important. Okay, 4, no dishonesty, bias, or misrepresentation. This is simple but essential. Basically, don't fake data. Don't manipulate models. Don't twist your findings to suit a particular agenda. This is where credibility is going to basically live or die, right? Once your integrity is questioned in this field, it is very hard to rebuild that trust. So think twice about doing any of those things. And finally, you have to represent your profession with respect. And this last point is about, professional image and how you market your services, how you communicate with your clients, and how you talk about your work in the public. Even outside of formal assessments, how you carry yourself is going to reflect on the entire field. So think of it as a bit of a social license, not just for projects, but for the way you live your life. All right. And with those kind of, ideas surrounding ethics, those ethical guidelines, I wanted, if we were all in class together today, for you to have a bit of a group discussion about this, but maybe turn into a personal reflection, and we'll circle back to this on Thursday. I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you're hired by a proponent. A model predicts that chemical concentrations in fish are below the regulatory limit. However, you know that the model is imperfect and based on its own assumptions, and you've had very limited and poor quality baseline data to populate it. I want to hear from you what you as an honest broker would do. Would you accept the model's results and report the impact as insignificant? Would you report the results but fully disclose all of the uncertainties and data limitations, potentially making your prediction seem unreliable to a regulator? And when you answer this question, I'd like you to think about, what are the ethical or career implications of your action? Take a moment, maybe post on the discussion board what your position is here. And when we come back together on Thursday, on September 11th, we'll set aside about 10 minutes for you to have a brief discussion with a partner. That's it. That's the end of the asynchronous lecture for today. I just want to remind you that on Thursday, on September 11th, you need to read Chapter 2, which is Environmental Assessment in Canada. We're going to go into that history of environmental assessment in Canada in a bit more depth. Some driving questions just to help with your reading. Really, can you describe the historical development of EIA in Canada? It is being suggested that all of Canada should be governed by a single EIA regulatory framework. I'd really like to know whether or not you agree with that or not, or whether or not you think, this federal, provincial, kind of local, multi-jurisdictional approach is better. And finally, what are the primary differences between the Impact Assessment Act, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 2012? That last question could very easily show up on an exam, so I would pay special attention to it. As always, if you'd like to come to my Zoom office hours, they're on Mondays from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., and you can always give me an email at mike.jaroski@ubc.ca. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you have a lovely day. Bye-bye now.